Even though it's dominated our lives for most of 2020, we've still got a lot to learn about COVID-19. And one of the main questions scientists are still figuring out is how the virus may have passed from animals to humans. As you might know already, the current theory is it may have originally developed in bats before being passed on to a pangolin and then onto humans. But this whole issue has shone a light on illegal wildlife trafficking and animal welfare issues, because they might have created the perfect condition for that deadly contamination to happen in the first place. In this video, we're going to take a look at the wildlife industry, how it's become linked to coronavirus, and why it'll be so tough to stop it. To understand what's going on, the first thing you need to know is that the illegal wildlife industry is a weird and secretive industry. The UN estimates that between 5 to 18.5 billion pounds worth of animals and animal products are trafficked every year. But it's really difficult to monitor an underground industry like this. It's believed to be the fourth biggest global criminal enterprise behind drug trafficking, counterfeiting, and human trafficking. In some cases, exotic wildlife is seen as a status symbol, a luxury item, a symbol of wealth. They could be used as pets too.
And nobody's gonna tell me any otherwise.
But usually their body parts are eaten as a delicacy, and they're used for medicinal purposes as well. Okay, so what exactly has illegal wildlife trafficking got to do with coronavirus? That's where this guy comes in. It's a pangolin, a scaly creature that is thought to be one of the most trafficked mammals in the whole world. Between 2000 and 2019, it's estimated nearly 900,000 pangolins were trafficked across Asia. But scientists now think that pangolins might have passed coronavirus to humans after catching it themselves from bats. The WHO says the disease first emerged in Wuhan in China. Evidence suggests it could have come from the Huanan market, a wet market that's suspected of selling wild animal meat, if not the live wild animals themselves. A wet market traditionally sells fresh fruit, vegetables, meat and seafood, and it's called wet because of the ice used and water splashed on produce to keep it fresh. Most wet markets do not sell live exotic animals, but some wet markets across Asia have wildlife sections within them. We spoke to someone from Traffic, a non-profit aiming to protect natural biodiversity and stop illegal animal trafficking. But since she works undercover surveying markets and traders across China, she's asked to keep her identity a secret.
Most of the animals are not handled in a very sanitary way. You might see the cages stocked up and there's no plates or no division between the cage. So the feces from the top cage may go down to the bottom one, and each cage probably contains different species.
China has faced an incredible backlash for its wildlife consumption as a whole, not just for illegal animal trafficking. Because yes, breeding and selling endangered wildlife like pangolins was illegal, but doing it with lots of other wild animals was still technically within the law, like civet cats, bats, porcupines and peacocks. Before coronavirus hit, breeding and selling those animals was still legal. In China, the industry is worth an estimated £60 billion, employing more than 14 million people. Now, you might think it's weird that selling certain animals is legal, but others are not legal. But that's because of China's history. China suffered from economic distress in the late 1950s due to failed agricultural policies. It caused the Great Chinese Famine, the largest in human history, where tens of millions of people died. So the government introduced sweeping agricultural reforms in the 1970s, part of which rural farmers were encouraged to start breeding wild animals to survive. And ultimately, this helped to alleviate poverty among the poorest people. There's a misconception that diseases like SARS, bird flu, and the coronavirus started in Asia because Asian people eat wild animals. And it's true that some people do eat certain high-risk animals. But the real problem is the way these wet markets are set up, with everything packed so tightly together. It means that animals that aren't usually in close proximity to each other in the wild end up being forced together in inhumane conditions. Coronavirus has raised questions over how ethical our standards really are, even in terms of raising animals that we consider okay to eat.
This is Diogo Verissimo, a research fellow at Oxford Martin School at the University of Oxford, who's been looking into conservation and consumer behaviour.
Everyone's talking about wet markets, wildlife trade in Asia, but of course there is a lot going on at home that we could also do and think about it and change in order to reduce in order to reduce this illegal wildlife trade. not just in the case of Europe, for example, the pet trade, in the case of disease transmission, also think about the livestock industry.
So let's be completely honest here. This is a global issue. Wet markets are a big and very concerning part of this. But to really understand and tackle this problem, we need to look right across the world. The 2009 swine flu was believed to have begun on a pig farm in Mexico, and bird flu came from poultry living in wet markets. With the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic, some experts think it might have started in the US. And of course, here in the UK, mad cow disease killed nearly 200 people and led to decades-long bans of British beef exports to places like the US and Japan.
In a recent report, the WWF has said 3 to 4 animal-to-human diseases emerge every year. They say COVID-19 is a devastating wake-up call that humanity's broken relationship with nature affects not only the wildlife and natural ecosystems whose habitats are being destroyed, but also threatens human health. By continuing to damage natural habitats, humans risk incurring the terrible costs of new zoonotic diseases, as well as increased exposure to other threats, such as climate change.
Sometimes it's also easy to focus on things that are far away and don't really require any change on our part personally, than to focus on the things that are really close, and then that would mean then to address them, we'd actually have to change the way that we live our own lives.
Scientists are still yet to confirm the link between the consumption of pangolins and coronavirus. But since the outbreak began, China has now taken steps to curb the wild animal industry. On the 24th of February, it temporarily banned the consumption of wild animals. However, on the 20th of May, Wuhan authorities ruled a total ban on hunting, breeding, and consumption of wildlife. Coronavirus has prompted other countries to take steps as well. In Vietnam, which is another heavy hitter in the illegal wildlife trafficking industry, they've followed in China's footsteps to draft legislation against the practice. And Singapore and the Philippines have seized record numbers of pangolins and civet cats since the virus broke out. But how effective are these bans? After all, selling pangolins was already illegal in China. In the Philippines, Indonesia and Thailand, some markets have remained open throughout the pandemic. And experts are concerned that blanket bans will only drive people to buy and sell wild animals on the black market.
The physical market of wildlife start to shift it to online market, and there are more and more QR code show in the physical market, and the trader will encourage the potential buyer or existing buyer to reach them online so they can make deal in a more concealed way.
And there's another problem too. Some communities in Southeast Asia that usually rely on tourism are now facing economic hardship, and some reports suggest they are now turning to animal trafficking to make ends meet. We spoke to Dr. Teresa Mundita Lim, Executive Director of the ASEAN Centre of Biodiversity, an organisation monitoring wildlife conservation in Southeast Asia.
There has to be alternative ways to be able to support some of the communities that are dependent on such livelihoods. So along with enforcement, we need to address the demand and also education, awareness raising.
And will China be as heavy-handed as they have pledged to be? And there are many gaps in their legislation for animal products to be used in medicine and scientific research. Of course, people say it's not just an economic crackdown, but a cultural one that's needed to tackle the industry. After all, these animals wouldn't be trafficked worldwide if there wasn't a demand for them.
There's also a demand outside the ASEAN member states for meat, for pets, and that actually drives some local communities to harvest the wildlife so that they can meet the demand.
And some communities do genuinely rely on these resources for survival and might not know any difference.
So I think it's important to bear that in mind, that there are definitely big inequalities between some of the more high-income countries and lower-income countries when it comes to how people use these resources. And so if we were to go in and have a global ban on the consumption of wildlife, those people would also be the hardest hit.
It will be a while before we know for sure whether consumption of endangered animals was really behind coronavirus. But it definitely has people focusing on animal welfare issues. One thing we've learned is blanket bans might not be enough. In fact, it could make it harder to monitor illegal animal trafficking. Education, community engagement, and economic support is also key, so that people in more vulnerable communities don't have to rely on this industry to make ends meet. And while it's easy to hold faraway countries accountable for their treatment of animals, maybe it's time we also took a closer look at home to see how we can all reduce the chance of future pandemics.